Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Karan Academy. My name is Karan. I hope you all are doing super well. Today, we will have our last lecture on the condition side of things. And today, we'll be talking about pericardial disease. For the next few lectures, we'll be going through, I guess, the practical side of things, going through a few quizzes, ECGs, and so on. But let's finish up pericardial disease. So, what will we be talking about today? We'll be talking pericarditis, and on that note, talking about pericardial effusions as well as pericardial tamponade. Now, what is pericarditis? Well, we talked about myocarditis in our last lecture. So pericarditis is quite similar. It's an infection of it's an inflammation of the pericardium that is most common in young people aged between 20 to 50 years old. It is most commonly infective and viral in origin. Up to 70 to 90% of cases are viral, with the leading causes being Coxsackie and parvovirus. You can also see pericarditis in systemic conditions like CKD, SLE, as well as with ACS, and I'll go through each one of those as well. In terms of the symptoms, you get chest pain that's worse on lying down and better on leaning forward. Now, why do you get chest pain? Well, this is particularly because the pericardium has quite a vivid nervous innervation with C3, C4, C5. As you know, these are also invading the diaphragm and can present with chest pain. This is a very important differential to consider with younger patients presenting with chest pain that doesn't improve with things like rest or GTN. Also, shortness of breath, as well as myalgia and fevers, which is often that viral prodromal set of symptoms. One thing we worry about is constrictive pericarditis, and I'll talk a bit about what that is in a second. In terms of investigations we want to consider, ECGs are obviously going to be something that's quite early on in your investigation pattern. This is because we're looking and hopefully want to exclude any ischemic pathology. Also, you do see a change on ECGs with pericarditis. That is a diffuse saddle-shaped ST elevation that's global. So you see global ST elevation that's saddle-shaped, and this is what it usually looks like. You can also have increases in cardiac enzymes, so your TROPS as well as your CK, ESR and leukocytosis, all consistent with an inflammatory picture. In terms of a chest X-ray, you can often observe cardiomegaly and a water bottle appearance. Now, this is what that would look like. So you have quite obvious cardiomegaly, but it's called a water bottle appearance because the lower parts are symmetrically enlarged, and it almost looks like one of those older ancient Middle Eastern water bottles or like those clay pots. And here is kind of what the normal outline should be, and the parts highlighted in green are kind of the effusion, or the effusion. With an echocardiogram, you could see diffuse hypokinesis of certain parts of the cardiac wall, and this would be ever so prominent with constrictive complications. And the biopsy would most commonly show a lymphocytic infiltrate. Now, what are the types of pericarditis? So in terms of its onset, something that's days to weeks is typically acute. If it progresses onwards of 6 weeks, that is considered chronic. Now you can have autoimmune pericarditis, which is commonly seen in conditions like SLE, where you have other connective tissues in your body being affected. And as you know, the pericardium is quite fibrous in nature, and therefore your odds of getting an immune reaction at the pericardium is also possible. Next, we have uremic pericarditis. Now, this is an interesting one. With CKD, you have the buildup of uremic product throughout the body. Because the pericardium is so vascular, and because it's just a connective tissue membrane in essence, you can have leakage of a lot of the substances in the blood. Leakages of blood substances into the pericardial space. Now, if that is urea, that can be often quite inflammatory and also trigger a process of further exudative damage, causing pericarditis and inflammation. And it's always something we look for with the renal exam as well as with CKD. You can also have something called dry pericarditis, where I talked a bit about how you can have, I guess, that exudative fluid. And we talk about why we get that in a second, but you can also have a pericarditis that's just inflammatory without the effusion component. And lastly, we can have post-AMI pericarditis. That's obviously not going to be infective, and it has two types. So the more common one that you probably have heard of is Dressler's syndrome, and I'll go through that, but we also have pericarditis epistenocardica. I completely butchered that, but we'll talk about the difference between those two as well. So what is a pericardial effusion? Well, a pericardial effusion is, quite simply put, actually, no, let me go back and talk about these two while I can, because I will forget. So pericarditis epistenocardica is acute, Dressler is chronic. What is the difference? So when you have a transmural infarct, an infarct that damages all three layers of the that's through and through with the myocardium, we are often going to see that the myocardium is going to start leaking fibrous fluid and fibrous exudate, as does most ischemic tissue. Part of this is going to leak into the pericardial space, triggering an inflammatory process and therefore causing pericarditis. This can present concurrently with the AMI or up to 3 to 4 days since its onset. Next, we have Dressler syndrome. Now, Dressler syndrome is quite different to pericarditis epistenocardica. What happens with Dressler syndrome is you had your infarct, the tissue has died, it has now been replaced with fibrous tissue, and this fibrous tissue is quite rough. And when it rubs against the pericardium, it causes inflammation. So that is quite different to obviously what we saw earlier, that's an inflammatory and exudative process. And Dressler syndrome typically presents 4 to 6 weeks after an AMI. Now, I already talked about why you get an effusion. With inflammatory causes, there's vasodilation and increased permeability of the membrane, as with inflammation anywhere. You also need to know that the pericardium is a very vascular connective tissue, and therefore, with that high vascularity, you now have fluid leaking into the pericardial space. Firstly, this fluid can rub against the pericardium, causing further pain. You can also hear this rubbing on exam, and that's called a friction rub or a pericardial friction rub. You can also see this collection on an echo and drain it if required, and that's called a pericardiocentesis, and it's one of the first management options you would consider. If the degree of effusion is very high, it can lead to something called a tamponade, which is bad. A tamponade is always bad news. Why is it bad news? Well, a tamponade basically means that you have so much fluid around the heart that it's now compressing inwards on the heart and restricting its ability to function adequately. We've already talked about restrictive cardiomyopathies. It's going to present somewhat in a similar way, but more acute. And it typically presents with a triad of symptoms called the Beck's triad. That's a combination of low blood pressure, distension of the jugular veins, and muffled heart sounds. Why do we get those three? Okay. Firstly, with the compressive nature, you are not going to be able to generate the same cardiac output as you were earlier, therefore causing a low blood pressure. You will also get distension of the jugular veins because, as you know, the jugular veins drain into the heart. And if the heart is kind of constricted, you aren't going to be draining the jugular veins as well. And you're going to have a backflow into the jugular veins, causing distension. And it would also present with an elevated JVP. And lastly, because you have all this fluid around the heart, you're not going to be able to hear heart sounds particularly well. And that would present with muffled heart sounds. And how would you treat this? Well, you would treat this with something called a pericardiocentesis that I talked about earlier. It's an ultrasound-guided procedure where you insert a needle into the pericardial space and effectively drain this collection. In terms of other treatment options for pericarditis, we usually go medical management with anti-inflammatories. So ibuprofen and paracetamol in most cases. You can consider prednisolone if the cause is suspected to be more inflammatory than infective. But otherwise, they tend to have a good prognosis with a good recovery. And it's a common it's a common condition in certain groups, but a lot of cases go undiagnosed because they just don't present. Typically, they say that about 5% of acute ED chest pain presentations are pericarditis. So I guess it's a good number to know. But again, I think it's one of those things that's not super, super high yield, but definitely a differential to consider in the back of your minds. And that's all we had for pericardial disease. I hope that was helpful. And I'll see you guys in the next one. As always, please look after yourself and please look after your loved ones.